Good day, everyone. Wearable sensors are widely used in research. This includes, for example, wearable accelerometers, but also the algorithms and the software to work with the data. The development of these methods doesn't stand on its own. It's connected with actually efforts to improve human health and well-being. And that goes via this process. So method developers develop the methods, which could include sensors, algorithms, and software, which are then evaluated by method evaluators, who then pass on or recommend methods to researchers, physical activity researchers, and would then eventually gain insights that inform new guidelines and policy and interventions. And as you can imagine, at each of these stages of the process, there are different experts, different people who in a professional role specialize in doing what needs to be done at these stages. There are, of course, people who are involved at multiple stages of this process, but most people I know only focus on one or maybe two steps of this whole process. Therefore, we don't all talk to each other every day of the year, definitely, but just also some of us never see each other at conferences, and that is a potential vulnerability in this whole process, because that could lead to misunderstandings. So therefore, I'm coordinating this session to facilitate a discussion between these different roles in order to, hopefully contribute to a better mutual understanding. So to get a bit of an understanding of who's in the audience, we created a little poll for you to fill in to help us understand, like, which of these 4 roles do you identify most with? So Kat, if you could activate the poll. Okay, so take half a minute to fill it in. And you can fill in multiple options if you feel like you're not representing only one of them. Okay. Kat, can we see the result? Okay, so as expected, most of you are physical activity researcher, but it's also nice to see that some of you also feel, see yourself in one of the other roles. That's very good. Now, I will now explain how we have organized this session. So next, my China Pao will introduce a discussion panel, which also includes myself. And then next we follow with 3 discussion blocks, where a member of the discussion panel first starts with a pitch about a concern or a dilemma they had in their mind, they see from within their role. And then that is followed by a panel discussion, where you as audience also have the option to post your comments and questions in the chat. And then Annelinde Letting, who's also here today, will help translate all these comments and questions you may post to the discussion. And then at the end, we finish with reflections by Tracy Kolbe Alexander, who Mai will also introduce in a minute. And we finish off with a 15-minute wrap-up, where we try to, together with you, try to summarize what the take-home messages are of today. Okay, so now, Mai, the word is to you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. It's a special pleasure to well, keep an eye on the time and introduce the speakers, because it's the first time that we have ISPEMPA Dare2Share sessions and an annual meeting. And actually, this is the second one. So it's, I really hope it adds on to the symposia, orals, and other types of sessions we already have at annual meetings. So thank you for inviting me. Well, I'm also very pleased that we have such an excellent panel tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, wherever you are. We have Professor Ulf Ekelund from the Department of Sports Medicine, Norwegian School of Sports Sciences in Norway. Sarah Cozy-Kiedel from the Department of Kinesiology and Public Health of California Polytechnic State University of the United States of America. Vincent van Hees, who's an independent consultant at his own company, Xchange, and I'm very happy that he also spends some hours in my group at the Department of Public and Occupational Health at the Amsterdam University Medical Centers. And special thanks to Tracy Kolb-Alexander, who joined us at a later stage to reflect on all the pitches and the discussion with you as the audience we will enjoy the coming 1.5 hours. So the first pitcher is Ulf. The floor is yours.
Thank you, May, and thank you to Vincent for inviting me to this session. Can someone give a thumbs up if you can hear me okay and if you can see my slides? Brilliant. Okay, so I suppose my role here is to be the user or representing the user or the researcher's perspective. I was pleased to note that I'm representing 90% of the audience, so it seemed to be a tall order to represent 90% of the audience. What I will just give you for the next 4 or 5 minutes, give an indication of where I see this is how we can work better together and what are the key challenges for a researcher or a user of device measured physical activity. So in my view, let's see if I can change slides. Okay, so in my view, I think as a physical activity researcher, as a physical activity epidemiologist, I think we try to understand a few key things. We try to understand where people are physically active, when they are physically active, and who are physically active. This is basically descriptive epidemiology. And we also try to understand time trends. How do physical activity and sedentary behavior change over time? Another important research area is obviously what factors determines physical activity and sedentary behaviors. What are the biological, environmental, demographic, and anthropometric factors and other factors that determines how physically active we are and our sedentary behaviors. And obviously, both to understand the descriptive epidemiology of physical activity and the determinants of physical activity and the health associations with physical activity, we need good, valid, accurate methods to assess physical activity. And I mean, in historically, all these research questions try to be being addressed by using self-reported physical activity. And we know there are some limitations with self-report. There are obviously some advantages with using self-report as well compared to using device-measured physical activity and sedentary behaviors. But there are clearly limitations associated with some specific bias, social desirability biases, etc., etc. But these are the 3 or 4 main, from my point of view, main areas of research where we want to understand physical activity even better. So what are then the keys? So just to give you a brief snapshot, if we measure physical activity by self-report from the graph to the left, which is the association between self-reported physical activity and mortality risk, and the same association between moderate and vigorous intensity physical activity measured by accelerometry and mortality risk. So if we look at the shape of the dose-response associations, they're almost exactly the same. But the difference between these two measures is that the magnitude of effect is considerably greater for device measured physical activity. The risk reduction is about 60% from device measured physical activity compared to about 40% from self-reported physical activity. And the other thing is that the maximal risk reduction is observed at a much lower level of physical activity, about 20 to 25 minutes of moderate intensity activity per day from device measured physical activity, compared to 3 to 5 times the recommended levels of physical activity. I mean, 3 to 5 times 150 minutes is considerably more than 20 to 25 minutes of moderate intensity activity. So this is just an example where we have moved during the last maybe 10 years, 10, 15 years away from self-reported methods and using device measured physical activity. And we have learned quite a lot by using device measured physical activity. I think the key challenges related to device measured physical activity in sedentary time, one of the key challenges is basically feasibility. And that relates to participant burden and compliance with our participants. We need to have methods that are low burden for participants and where we can get a high compliance. The placement is important. Do we place the monitor on the wrist, on the hip, or wherever we place it? What type of wear do we use? What type of wear time protocol do we use? Is it a 24-hour wear time protocol? Is it a wake time wear protocol? The output from the monitor we are using is extremely important. It needs to be interpretable so we can make recommendations out of this. I also think it's important to have a measure that is consistent over time, so we can measure time trends, consistent in their output without any, we have no change in algorithms, so the algorithms should be consistent by time. And the third key point I've addressed is comparability. So we need to be able to compare, and this is a bit repetitive. We need to be able to compare different devices. We need to compare older data with recent data, and we need to be able to compare with data we are collecting in the future. So these are the key challenges I would like to discuss during this session with the audience. And I also just want to finish off by being a little bit provocative. And are we really asking the right questions as a physical activity society as a whole? Are we too much focused on analyzing our data using new methods, fancy metrics, and new fancy analytical approaches, rather than asking the important research questions related to physical activity epidemiology? So by that, I suppose I should leave the floor open for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulf. Excellent, as always. Are there, Annelinda, are there any questions or
not yet
reactions from the audience?
Otherwise, we as a discussion panel can also start, I guess. So, Ulf, in your list of key challenges, there was no accuracy. No. So do I conclude from this that you are actually quite happy with the methods as they are and are more concerned about consistency than about the lack of accuracy of existing methods? Is that a good interpretation?
Well, I think it's a good point. Obviously, the methods we are using need to be accurate, but I think most of the devices we are using today are probably accurate enough to answer the big questions. Obviously, I do want methods to be even more accurate, and I do want methods to be able to measure everything accurate, but today we don't have those methods. I mean, we don't have methods that are able to measure both intensity, frequency, duration, types of activities, positions in an accurate way. And obviously there are limitations, there are considerable limitations with many of the methods we are using. If we had a method that could measure energy expenditure instantaneously, together with the type of activity, I would be quite happy, but you as a method developer could probably not come up with such a method. Or do you know any engineer? And the method needs to be feasible as well. So,
yeah. Well, I guess everyone is aware of, a lot of method development goes into trying to address the current known weaknesses of methods. For example, for a specific sensor location, just pick any random sensor location, there must be something they can't do very well at the moment, or given the existing software, and research groups are very keen to help fill that gap. But I understand also your concern about consistency, that with all these methods, you of course also undermine harmonization. But if all this effort to build better methods leads to better research, then ultimately that's also good, because if our research is forever constrained by all these things we can't measure, then then we could also have a lot of missed opportunity. So for example, if 10 years ago the raw data collection came up, and yes, it took a lot of effort and lots of publications and new approaches to handle that. But looking back, it's kind of good that we went through this process. Otherwise, we would have still been stuck to the methods that were available before that, which definitely, I wouldn't say they were bad. They also had a lot of value and have resulted in a lot of research, but at least the newer methods provide a lot more transparency. And I hope we agree that that has been a step forwards, but yeah.
And I agree. I mean, using the raw data ultimately probably makes it more easy to compare the output from different types of monitors, at least in theory. I'm not sure whether they are 100% comparable in practice if you compare the raw acceleration signal from different monitors, but in theory they should be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the meantime, I see questions from the audience. Annalinde, you want to
Yes.
pick the first one?
I see a question from Sebastian Hasten. Dear Ulf, thank you for the introduction. What questions should we be asking?
Okay, I actually put up a few questions. I think it's important on my slide, but I didn't share them. But I think one of the key questions is still the exact dose response association between different physical activity variables and health and various health outcomes. I also think another key question is related to the domains of physical activity. There is currently a bit of a debate whether, for example, occupational physical activity is detrimental or beneficial for health. I think that's a key question where we need much more data. And my last key question I was thinking about was whether the association between physical activity and sedentary time are actually causal. I mean, we need to really use both observational data or the association between physical activity and sedentary time with health outcomes. If that association is causal, we need both observational data and we need combinations of different methods like Mendelian randomization, triangulation of data, and we need randomized control trials, even if it's extremely difficult to set up randomized control trials with hard clinical endpoints. I think those are the key questions we need to address as a society to even better understand how physical activity is related to health, which then will inform physical activity guidelines, interventions, and public health policy.
Thanks, Ulf. Can I ask a follow-up question? You mentioned randomized controlled trials, and for exercise training, I can see them, but how would you do that with maybe daily, more lifestyle physical activity?
I mean, there was actually, there is only, as far as I know, there's only one published randomized controlled trial using mortality as a clinical outcome, and this was the Norwegian study from the Trondheim group, which was published in BMJ earlier last year, maybe last year. I think it was last year, which was some sort of a trial aiming to increase everyday physical activity, even if it was a bit of an exercise training. Obviously, it was in elderly individuals. I mean, I think the average age at baseline was 70, and the name of the trial was Generation 100. So they aimed for the old ones, but still, I think we need to think along those lines. And even if we can't, I mean, it's going to be very difficult to conduct such trials, and it might not be possible, might not be feasible. But then we need to think about other big questions which we can address with observational data. And as I mentioned, I mean, Mendelian randomization studies, triangulation of data, etc., etc.
Thank you. And other questions?
Yes, in the meantime, I see a question that is upvoted from Estelle Lambert. Brilliant talk. Oh, a very difference in the self-reported dose versus the device measured dose is the behavioral conundrum to resolve, because we message in relation to self-report, so the perceived physical activity. So from a public health perspective, we need to figure out how to message more closely what the devices are capturing. How would you respond to that?
I can't hear you really very good, Anna-Linda, but I tried to read the question as well. So it's about the difference in self-reported dose versus device measured dose. Yeah, I mean, the self-reported physical activity is different from device measured physical activity. And I suppose the question is whether we should relay our recommendations on device measured or self-reported measured physical activity, which is difficult. Obviously, most of the majority of the evidence is today derived from self-reported physical activity, and I suppose it will be for the next couple of years, but more and more data will come, will be available from device measured physical activity. But yeah, I didn't really get the exact question, but maybe you can help me, Anna-Linda or Vicky. I think it was Vicky who posted.
Vicky can help.
Yeah.
Vicky, is your question answered, or otherwise we can unmute you?
And if Vicky can raise her hand, then we can unmute her and have a discussion.
I'm just going to comment because I know that there was, especially in the 2008 US guidelines came out, there was a lot of controversy about whether, adherence to guidelines can be assessed with a device, because self-report questionnaire at that time was almost exclusively what was used to make the guidelines. And now it really seems that we're at this inflection point where we're getting enough data from devices. And I think as Ulf shown, it's reassuring that the dose of that curve is similar. And then the same thing, Ulf, with your paper, looking at the joint effects with sedentary time and MVPA, the magnitude of how much MVPA you need to do to ameliorate the effects of sedentary time differs between devices and self-report questionnaires, but we're still seeing that same relationship. So to me, that's really reassuring that we're going to get to a point where we can start to get coherent guidelines out of device-based data. And I think it's worth noting too, though, that the adherence to guidelines, as well as that the magnitude of the dose response curve varies a lot by which threshold you use to process the accelerometer data. So it's not just this self-report versus device-based data. It's also within a device. If you use a lower cut point applied to the NHANES data, people are getting 60 minutes a day of MVPA. If you use a higher threshold, they're getting 10 minutes a day. So I think that that's where this issues with accuracy and comparability really are going to come into play, and sort of coming to some sort of consensus to get at this specific magnitude for guidelines is going to be the challenge.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. I agree, fully agree.
I see Vicky has joined us. Please go ahead. You should be unmuted. but we cannot hear you. Otherwise,
Maybe
we
we can
can answer
the time
another question.
Yeah, the one by Paul Hibbing, maybe.
Oh, Vicky is unmuted now?
No.
No?
I think, Paul, your comment is good, but I think we will also touch on that in Sarah's pitch in relation to how we can be more strategic in promoting certain methods, I guess, and also later I will pitch from the methods perspective.
Save a few comments for later.
Yeah, indeed.
And questions.
Other questions?
Well, I think the question of Hillary, well, touches upon the discussion we just had. She says, thank you for your presentation. I often think about how we develop physical activity guidelines based on accelerometer-based measured data, but then prescribe physical activity to people who don't have or use accelerometers all the time. How do you think this contributes to the low compliance with physical activity guidelines?
I think today most of the evidence for the physical activity guidelines, both the US guidelines and the WHO guidelines, are actually based on self-reported data, but they are supported by recent accelerometer measure data. So I don't think the guideline development in itself, or whether it's based on self-reported or device measure data, is related to the compliance with physical activity guidelines. But it's definitely, for sure, Sarah alluded to that, dependent on how you measure the compliance with the guidelines, whether you measure it with self-report or whether you measure it with accelerometry, and with what algorithms you are using from accelerometry, for example, that will definitely affect the compliance with the guidelines. And I think that's one of the key, basically one of the key issues we have to solve. How do we really assess compliance with guidelines from device measured physical activity? And I mean, we need to have some sort of an intensity threshold or whatever if we are interested in these intensity levels. And it might be a bit old-fashioned to think about intensity levels because there are so many new fancy metrics out there, but I still think that's the easiest way to communicate physical activity to the general public. And the general public have issues in understanding what is moderate intensity. But if you say you should do 25 minutes of walking per day or brisk walking per day, that's probably one of the easiest ways to communicate physical activity in terms of public health.
All right, thanks. For the sake of time, I suggest we move on to the next picture. Sarah Keedle, the floor is yours.
Can you see my screen and hear me? On this side? Okay. All right, so my role today was assigned as a method evaluator. And so I'm going to define that because it's a little bit ambiguous, at least to me. So, and we focus here on people who evaluate and compare methods, and then ultimately, I think, are advising applied users, which is 90% of the people in the room, and I think is really, you know, the most important role in many ways. I probably don't have to convince the 90% of you of that, but that, you know, ultimately we want to use these devices to improve how we understand how behavior relates to health. And so I see the evaluator as someone who works with developers in instituting and developing algorithms, and then working with applied users and deciding what to use. So, you know, most studies now are using devices in some capacity, and we're asking applied researchers to collect and store more and more data. So, you know, we started off with collecting 1 count per minute. We're now up to, you know, these 80 Hertz data files. They're large, they're a lot to manage, and the processing methods have become more complex. There's tons of published studies that estimate accurate aspects of physical behavior from devices. but virtually none of those are being used. And I think one of the things that Ulf raised is, do they need to be used or not? Are we okay with more simplistic metrics? To me, I think I'm not going to push that we need to be all using super complex machine learning algorithms, but I think that we are missing and there's a potential for getting more out of the signal, particularly as it relates to understanding activity type and doing a better job of using new algorithms to understand things like locomotion and walking behavior, and we're not using those consistently in applied studies. And so I think that there is a gap currently between the developers and the applied users, and that this evaluator needs to try to fill that role and help make this process, fill the link of that chain. So we have our methods developers who have really different questions that they're interested in. I see the evaluators as the people kind of in the middle. Some of you may recognize Patty Friedson here in my slide. She was my doctoral advisor. And to me, she was sort of the ultimate evaluator, that she really didn't have much understanding of statistics. She had a really great understanding of physiology and a knowledge that we want to use activity to improve health. And she really spent her career trying to bring together people from these two diverse areas and to, and she really was instrumental in moving this field forward. So developers are interested, they're computational scientists, they're interested in questions like what machine learning methods produce the most accurate results, what's the impact of differences in filtering or firmware, or is the raw output comparable across different devices? Applied researchers, we've talked about these questions, dose of MVPA to improve longevity. And then there's a lot of people who are, probably many in this room, who are conducting intervention research and just want to know, did my intervention work? They don't want to know which firmware it was, which algorithm was applied. They just want to know, did the people in my study increase walking? So the evaluators, I think, need to have an understanding of what method is the most accurate and reliable under real world conditions to be able to communicate with applied researchers. And then I think that they have to have an understanding of some of the practical considerations, the reproducibility of both the methods, so is the algorithm available to be in an open source software, as well as some of the logistical concerns that I saw someone raised earlier. What's the cost of the device, those types of things, and can help inform, make an informed decision about what to use in your study. Some of the challenges, I think, in communicating with developers that I just wanted to touch on, there's a lack of common language as methods get more complex. I work with data science undergraduate students, and it still takes me, at least a couple of weeks to just get on the same page about what are the, what's the goal of this project, when they're talking in super complex data terms and I'm talking in physical behavior, just getting on the same page and having that common language is challenging. I think that in our field, there's a lack of consensus on the common ground truth measures, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit at the end. Practical considerations come into play when designing and conducting studies. And then there's this just difference that the metrics, I want to know if my intervention worked to increase walking, and I have developers who are looking at this, signal in a particular way, and just getting an understanding of that can be challenging. Oops, forwards. I think with applied users, one of the big challenges, and this is, I think, a problem that the so-called evaluators need to assess, is that we currently consider methods validated, whether they were tested on 10 people who were walking around a track and we found that, they accurately predicted walking, or 1,000 people in natural conditions compared to a criterion. So we have this sort of loose phrasing of the term validated for a particular method that comes out, and it's not consistent how we validate methods across studies. And so it becomes difficult to say you should choose this method when there's so much variability in how rigorous the evaluation of that method was. This is a framework that we published in 2019, looking at trying to at least begin to standardize the way we evaluate sensors. So not standardizing which sensor should be used or which location, but to think about the way we evaluate sensors in a consistent way. So if we think about over here on the left, looking at the reliability of device output, the signal testing, I see that really as the computational scientists developing and calibrating methods. And then over on the far right, the adoption phase of implementing new devices into applied studies is really the applied researcher. And I think that the evaluators have to do a better job here in the middle of really conducting rigorous studies that evaluate these methods in real world conditions. I'm gonna skip. And we have a few recommendations within that paper that we need to conduct evaluations in natural conditions, use gold standard criterion measures, try to make sure that our protocols are based on time use so that we're getting a range of behaviors within that direct observation or doubly labeled water or something where we're getting, but we're making sure we're getting a range of behaviors within that, including diverse participants, validating methods, and then using appropriate statistical evaluations. I think some of the key challenges and maybe points for discussion. This is a lot of work to do direct observation, to do doubly labeled water is expensive, it's time intensive. And so we need to have mechanisms for data pooling and begin to put forward data challenges that computational scientists can work on. I think we need to come to a better consensus for operationally defining some of our criterion measures. So I'm currently involved in a project looking at how different sites code video labeled direct observation data. How are they quantifying sitting, walking, standing? And overall it's similar, but there are definitely differences in how we're conceptualizing these things. So if you're doing weightlifting, for example, and you lift weights and then you sit for a minute, is that sitting between sets a sedentary behavior, or is that something different? And so just thinking through some of these nuances of how we label data and come up with our criterion measures is important. And then finally, I think that overall our field really needs to have investment in software to ensure methods are reproducible. And I imagine Vincent's going to touch on this quite a bit in his talk as well. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Sarah, for also your excellent pitch. Are there already any questions from the audience? Otherwise, the panel can start.
I have a question. So I think it's a brilliant talk. It's good to create kind of a framework for people to take as a reference, and to, especially people new to the field, which especially applies to data scientists from outside physical activity research field. It's good to give them some framework. So on that, I agree. But I'm a bit in doubt about telling people what the gold standard is. I think for pretty much everything we can measure in physical activity or sedentary behavior, there is not really a 100% gold standard. Pretty much every method exists that we sometimes consider as gold standard has some kind of limitation. So I think the focus should not be too much on what is, establishing gold standard validity, but focusing on that we understand what we are measuring. So regardless of whether it 100% aligns with some energy expenditure or observation. So I think in a framework like that, I would leave space for a variety of interpretations. So I think it's more important that people understand what they are measuring, even if it means that it's not exactly what they want to measure. So for example, step counting, if we all know that we are always counting one step too many, that's better than having, well, it's maybe a bad example, but then the 100% accuracy of, if you understand the pattern of misclassifications, that can sometimes already be helpful to do research with it. But maybe I should stop talking and
yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. And I think, I agree. I think I have actually a table that I didn't show for time that, talks about what are some of what we consider criterion or ground truth. I think gold standard maybe puts too much pressure on what that criterion is, and that there is going to be, nothing's perfect. But at the same time, I think that, if we're working with computational scientists, we have to give them some sort of labeled data set that says, this is your signal, this is the ground truth. Go figure out how to get as close to that ground truth as possible. And so if we have consistency across physical activity researchers in what types of labeled data we're giving people, whether it be indirect calorimetry, direct observation, photo direct observation, video direct observation, whatever it is, if we're consistent across that, then I would expect that different algorithms from different research groups would start to converge. But right now we are a little bit haphazard. I think that, so I'll stop there.
Sarah, what do you think is the reason for this lack of consensus maybe among physical activity researchers or developers? I don't know, because if you look at validation studies, everyone kind of validates their own method. So
Yeah,
you have 100 validation studies of 100 different methods, and so what, as a physical activity researcher, what method should you choose?
Right. So I think that's a huge problem. And it's not just that each group is doing their own validation study, they're also doing it in a completely different way.
Yeah.
So if I validate sitting while somebody's sitting at their office, relatively still typing on a computer, that's different than validating sitting when someone's in a car and there's a ton of acceleration signal, or that's different than validating, or if I'm looking at somebody walking consecutively for an hour, my method's going to do better than if I'm looking at someone sitting, getting up, down, moving, and doing intermittent movement. And so I think that that's where in the paper, we really argue that we should be using some sort of time use framework to develop protocols for validating studies, because even if people are validating their own methods, at least if they're doing it in the same way with relatively similar activities, we could start to compare better across studies. Whereas right now I could choose to do, I always use the example of someone like frisbee golf, walking and sitting as my 3 activities, and say my method's validated, and somebody else could be doing, driving, and I'm going to get completely different results just because of those activities. And so I think that's a huge problem in how we evaluate studies right now.
Sarah, can you just summarize where are we with pattern recognition or activity type recognition? Where are we at in the development?
I mean, I think it's hard to answer that question, because I mean, there's tons of groups who have done it. And I think the biobank group has, classified these broad activity types and have done a really rigorous evaluation of that. And then I think that there's lots of other groups who have done it, but they're not being used, right? So we're not taking those methods and putting them into applied studies and showing, oh, look, this is better than just knowing a threshold or not. And so I think that there are, I think for classifying walking behavior, where there's methods available, but they're not easy to access. There's not open source software to say, hey, take this and go do it today and see what happens in your study. So I think that there's lots of signal processing development that shows there's different patterns, but there's very few methods that are like, go use this in your study and it's going to work and do better, is my impression. Others may keep up with that more and comment differently, but that's...
So it's that the methods are not kind of promoted to use and are also not open source?
I think that it's that people are developing methods and there's no sort of way to implement them easily in studies. I think it's one challenge. And then I think the other challenge is that they're developing them often in this, what we call the early phase of the framework. So someone has developed and tested their own method, but they're then not rigorously evaluating whether it really works in another data set or things like that. So I think that there's lots of progress in the area, but there's no sort of consensus on, yes, this is a good method to use, go use it. Reviewers aren't going to question if you use this method because it's accepted. There's definitely nothing available like that at this phase.
And how could we improve that?
I think that efforts to pool data and conduct these rigorous evaluation trials that where people are following relatively similar protocols and looking at different methods, not just the ones that they developed, would help.
Or a list of maybe a standard methods that everyone should use in every validation study?
Do methods?
Like
yeah,
like a minimum kind of set.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense to me. I think, there's a lot of, you don't want standardization to stifle innovation, but I think if you can standardize some of the ways that we do things, then the protocols that we use to evaluate sensors, that then you can still have that innovation, but at least be able to compare across different methods, how they're working.
So
questions
there are a couple of questions from the...
Yeah.
Yeah, so I see Paul Hewing has got a question for you, Sarah. As methods become more complex, can we assume they will eventually be packed in user-friendly software, or will it be inevitably become a requirement that each project has a data science team member who can wade through the computational complex aspects of the device use? I have always assumed the former, but in practice, I have so far observed the latter.
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. And I think that the former is obviously preferable. I think both because of ease of use for applied users, but also because of reproducibility and making sure that methods are consistent. You know, it's easy to have a bug in a software if it's passed around and each group is doing it slightly differently. Having said, I mean, I think that there's going to be backlash from applied users that are having these huge data files and then needing to hire someone to, you know, with data science expertise to implement. But I agree that that's tending to be the way that it is. And I also think that people who have that expertise, and I know Vincent has done a good job of this, is you need to advocate for, you know, you wouldn't collect blood samples and not have a plan in place for how you're going to process those blood samples in your study. You're going to pay a lab to do it. And I think that thinking of people who can implement these methods into their studies is a similar way. And, you know, I've had a lot of people come up and say, hey, can you just process my data for me? And it's like, well, that's a lot of time. And I can't just do that off the cuff on a Friday afternoon for your study for no money. So I think that that's something that we need to sort of push for. So I think it's going to be a little bit of both. You're going to need someone with some expertise, but then we can't expect every applied user to have someone like that on their team that's going to do it.
So I see another question from Rosemary Walmsley. Thank you. You've just touched on it, but I wonder if you could comment a bit more on which the panel think is a more effective and pragmatic workflow. Work out constructs you're aiming to measure, develop a method to measure that, and validate it, or develop measures which measure some useful aspect of activity or behavior, spend time figuring out exactly what they're measuring and associate that with the health outcomes.
So I would go with the former. I think we clearly have to say, what's our construct? What is it that we're trying to measure? How good can we get at measuring that and validate it? I don't think it means we're going to be perfect at measuring every construct that we want to, but that's my preferred. I think others may have different opinions on the panel, but I think that that's important.
I agree, but I also think it's important to, I mean, select a method that is suitable to address your research question.
Yes.
And I think Sebastian commented on it. And I mean, if we are interested in looking at change in physical activity, we need a method that is sensible to detect change. It doesn't need to be 100% accurate. And I think that's perfectly correct, because I mean, the research question should basically tell us what method we're going to use.
I completely agree. And I think that it's okay that it's going to be different by study design and type. And, you know, these metrics like overall, like NMO and overall are incredibly useful for many of the population-based studies. They're going to be less useful for an interventionist who wants to know, did, you know, walking on trails increase as a result of my intervention? And that's okay. Not everybody has to agree on what the metrics are that we're going to get out of things, and they may select a different wear location or a different device or processing method because their question is different. And we just have to be really clear about what the strengths and limitations are.
I'm really sorry, but time's up. So we're moving to the next picture, but we have time at the end for a general discussion. Well, Vincent, the floor is yours. Yeah, you're muted. We cannot hear you.
Thank you. So I'm representing the method developers. Now, what do we do? Well, maybe that's good to clarify. I see that method developers can take on one or multiple of 3 different roles. So a purely facilitating role, where we develop a method and share it, the research tools, or sell the research tools. So obviously, I'm an advocate of open source, but I'm also including, so you could also see this as, for example, the accelerometer manufacturers. They also have a very facilitating role in the research community, and occasionally also algorithm developers take that role. So it's then the physical activity researcher says, for example, we want to measure the movement of this body part, and then without asking too many critical questions, you as a facilitator, you just start developing that and try to work out, okay, how can we do that? Because the physical activity researcher wants this to be measured. Then the next role is a bit more collaborative, and that's most visible as being co-author on physical activity research papers. So for example, I have never led on a physical activity research paper intentionally, but occasionally I'm a co-author, and I do that because I've collaborated with physical activity researchers or sleep researchers. And by being co-author, I've helped them to make sure that at least the method section is well written. And it helps me to get a global idea of what all this research is about and what the general trend is. And then the last role is more a research role, where within the method development, where you explore new methods and try to build on expertise in methods. And I think these different roles, different people have different focus, of course, and most people you encounter in academia will, of course, have a strong emphasis on the research role, but occasionally we also have to be in a bit more facilitating role. And maybe it's good to mention that a lot of what we do in the research role is therefore not necessarily directly aimed at facilitating physical activity research. Sometimes it's purely aimed at building up expertise around machine learning methods, because you can only develop and build a machine learning method or advise on whether it's useful if you have really dived into all the possible options. And from a physical activity research perspective, that might look like, what are these technicians doing? Why are they wasting their time with only a sample size of 10? And why are they tweaking all these algorithms all the time? But engineers in general and computer scientists do this as a first step in mastering a certain technology. You can't really advance the technology before mastering what is already exists. So, so it can be that sometimes you perceive a method developer as not being oriented towards facilitating, but that has a reason. So, and as you can imagine, if you are in a more facilitating role, then yeah, you are also usually less in a more in a commercial role or in a research support role rather than a pure. So I don't know anyone who built a full academic career developing methods in a very facilitating role to the physical activity research community. You then easily end up working a bit more outside academia. So the challenge I want to discuss is how to, as a method developer, I find it, of course, there is one challenge to develop the methods, but another big challenge I see is to how to influence the users of the methods and how they use the methods I and others develop. And you could compare this a little bit like statisticians. Statisticians know everything about statistical techniques. They are not always directly involved in the research, but obviously they have a meaning of an opinion about how their statistical method should be used. And it's the same with method developers in physical activity research. We may not know the answer to every question and we may not always be right, but I think our opinions about how to measure physical activity should be heard. And you might think like, well, that can't be too difficult. You are collaborating with researchers, but let's go stay in this slide. The challenge is if you as a physical activity research method developer see that systematically in a research field everyone is making the same mistake, or or a published paper has not used a method in the way it was intended to be used, then yeah, that's outside your control. You can't be emailing everyone that uses your method to tell them, sorry, I don't like how you use my method. So it needs to be a bit more of a, so there are a couple of pathways to provide feedback as a methods expert, and you could easily visualize for yourself a statistician if that helps, but also as an algorithm developer for physical activity researcher, this applies. So for example, social media, you could say, well, just share your thoughts on social media. Well, the challenge with that is that usually when physical activity research is promoted online, for example, after a breakthrough in research or with new physical activity guidelines, I'm always very hesitant to express my criticism because I know that I will be undermining your message to promote physical activity. So if you want to tell the world that everyone should be more active, then I can understand that it's not really welcome that I then start criticizing your algorithm. So for me, social media is kind of tricky because I know that we have different interests, which will then conflict. A letter to the editor, well, of course, sometimes that works, but that's time consuming. And for me, it also feels very confrontational. It's like it doesn't always facilitate a very constructive discussion where you leave space for each other to admit mistakes or to, and of course, it's time consuming. At conferences, well, of course, the eCampam conference series tries to bring together these disciplines, but generally, including the eCampam conference, I feel that it's generally difficult to get physical activity researchers and method developers in the same room without the discussion ending up very much about how can method developers better help the researchers rather than what can the researchers do better in the use of existing methods. And so a more level conversation. So then two more things, that's the end of my pitch, is how can method of, I think one solution might be that method experts are more included as specialist reviewers in journals. So just like a statistician, that sometimes you just get a method expert to just review only the accelerometer data processing. And in line with what I said about conferences, I think it would be good if maybe conferences or journals make more effort to facilitate an interdisciplinary discussion and balance. So not only in where the method developers are in a facilitating role. And that's also one of the reasons why we organized this session to make a start with it. And that's where I want to end my pitch.
Thank you, Vincent. Also excellent. And I see a lot of room for improvement. Are there any questions from the audience this time? Or shall we kick off again as?
Vincent, I have a question. So when you say that they're applied researchers are using a method perhaps inappropriately, do you mean in terms of how it's how the output is interpreted and what it means, or in what way?
Yeah. Sorry, that I usually in the interpretation side. So to give an example, I developed a method to classify nighttime sleep, and I've always tried to be careful in, well, regardless of what you think of that method, at least I've been trying to be careful about its ability to detect daytime sleep, so naps. I've always been like, no, I'm not sure yet whether we can classify that. But there has been a publication where people used that method and classified, well, claimed to have classified daytime sleep and didn't raise any concern in the discussion section about the limitations of the method. And then I feel like that, that was not my intention. I think it would be better if we do first more research to justify its use. And I think, and I've seen that a couple of times also in physical activity research, where people, of course, want to answer the big research questions like, does taking a nap during the day, is that important for your health? But are then, of course, not, someone should slow them down and say, oh, wait a minute, the existing methods are not that great yet. And I feel like probably there should have been a reviewer on that paper who had asked the authors to phrase that a bit more careful, because I think it's not really helping anyone. And it's not because I want, it's not good for me, it's not good for them. And it can be really misleading at some point if everyone starts talking about that certain construct or that estimate, while actually it has never been validated.
Questions have arisen already, and Linda?
Yes, from Margaret Raber, Fitbit has some 200 US patents in space and just sold to Google for over $2 billion US. Any comments from the panel on handling intellectual property issues in innovative method development?
Well, my personal opinion is that if we come up with a new algorithm and we release it open source, then it's protected by the open source license, and inherent to open source license, it means that Fitbit can use it as long as they are open about using that algorithm. And I think that's the best solution yeah. I personally wouldn't. I'm not a big fan of any method that's closed, but I mean, there are probably clear purposes. I can see, for example, in intervention studies that it's not always realistic to use a research grade accelerometer, and maybe Fitbit is very useful. But in terms of yeah, that research would be damaged because they have patents. I'm not really sure. As long as we make sure that our work is shared and accessible, then it's up to Fitbit how they want to participate or not.
Thank you, Vincent.
Questions?
From Sebastian Casten. Vincent, how do you think developers can convince PA researchers to make better use of development? And do you see a role for the developers to sometimes challenge some dogma?
Well, I think the starting point is the communication. I personally feel like I'm interacting with, of course, the people I collaborate with, but I'm not really in touch with the broader physical activity research community enough. I think I should attend this conference more often and in that way. But to answer his question, I think so. I personally think it would be valuable if we are more frequently invited as a peer reviewer on physical activity research papers. So I've been active in this field since 2009, and I think I've been invited to peer review a physical activity research paper less than 10 times. This is not an invitation to our editors to send the papers to me, but just to clarify to you that if you're not a physical activity researcher, then you are also not really on the radar of the of the editors.
I think the editors, well, if there are any editors in the room, well, we'll definitely give your message to Hidde, because I think every journal would be really happy with excellent reviewers. But how do you is that feasible? Because there are more and more journals, more and more papers. Well, will be overloaded with papers.
Well, I think if it's clear that that you are only involved to have a quick look at only the accelerometer data processing section, for example, and that your peer review is only relevant for that and should be treated as some kind of a, and I think that is a lot quicker. I mean, I can, in less than half an hour, I should be able to have a look, and I mean, maybe then, yes, but it is tricky, so we need to think, but maybe, especially I think, because most of those times I was invited, I didn't feel that those were high profile papers, but especially on these high profile papers where it really matters, where a new guideline is proposed or a new vision is proposed, maybe those are good moments to invite methodological experts. And also I'm sometimes wondering whether these physical activity guidelines processes, I've never taken part in it, and I'm also not sure what I should do if I would sit on the table, but it might be good for the people who sit on that table to think about, okay, but at what time do you want to involve someone with more methodological perspective? And especially, so that's always my little bit of criticism against physical activity guidelines, is that they don't come with a measurement instruction, and that complicates adherence. And rather than, and I understand that it is all difficult. It's like the guidelines are designed for a different purpose, not entirely only to be measurable. But having this kind of discussions might be good before the guideline is released, rather than afterwards, because then it's just an afterthought. So I think
good suggestion. Annalena, more
Yeah,
questions?
okay, well,
Oh, sorry.
since I've been involved in a bit of guideline development, and maybe some other people who can comment on it, I think, Vincent, since the guidelines are developed for public health purposes and they are derived from numerous different instruments who have measured physical activity in minutes or physical activity and energy expenditure, or in minutes in moderate and vigorous intensity activity, with tens of or hundreds of different physical activity instruments. Is it really then possible to be crystal clear about, okay, so these are the guidelines, 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity per week is the current guideline from both from the US and WHO. Should we then say, okay, so if you want to assess adherence to this guideline, you should use this instrument to measure it? Is that what you're saying?
No, I fully understand the challenge, and I know there is no perfect method, but so I see two parts to it. So one is then we also need to be clear that adherence measurement is we shouldn't expect anyone to be have consistent findings in adherence measurement. So if because often people complain about methods not being comparable when you measure adherence to physical activity guidelines, but I think we should then also agree that that's a consequence of how the guidelines are developed. So, and
what would be the I mean, what expertise in this case do you think a method developer would serve? I mean, I would be happy to help to discuss it and have someone.
Yeah.
But what kind of specific expertise?
Well, if we could go that route, then I could think about that even though there are hundreds of methods used underlying the guidelines, maybe it's possible to have a discussion about, is there not a short list of questionnaires that, because if you look at the underlying evidence underneath the guidelines, you should be able to compile a list of key papers that drive the guideline and say like, okay, in these papers, we use this and this questionnaire, or we use that accelerometer brand on that location, and not say everyone should use those methods, but to provide, if people really want to measure adherence to the guidelines, then they should use one of those methods because that has a better chance of really measuring adherence to guidelines. I know this is not something a single person can decide on. It requires a discussion and maybe the end. And I can't guarantee that it will lead into an agreement on what to do, but I think it's important that we make an effort to see, like, can we not come up with kind of some guidelines on a guideline on how to measure the guideline, kind of.
I think it's more than. Sorry. I think it's more than just about the guidelines, and I think we need to be careful of getting sort of all consumed about it's the guidelines and are they meeting the guidelines. We are using these devices for other reasons, and just like we mentioned earlier, you know, the research question will help determine which device we might use. And so I think we shouldn't just get wrapped up in which device is best to measure the guidelines, because from a public health practitioner point of view, many people are not going to be wearing devices when they're delivering their messages. So I think it's bridging that gap between all the different views and channels that we've heard today. But I think we should be careful about being too wrapped up. It's all, you know, about the guidelines.
But just to clarify, this discussion Ove and I had was specific to the studies who try to measure adherence to guidelines. So I understand that it's a broader perspective.
All right. In sake of time, I would like to give the floor to Tracy for a reflection on the past pitches and discussions. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
I've tried to jot down some notes as we were going along and have some discussion points. I think the first component of the reflection is really needing a combination of methods. I don't think we should see a one-size-fits-all approach. And what seemed to come across quite a lot for me was translation of these device-based measures into real life. And when we go back to the title of this session, it's really taking this into policy and practice. And so I think that's an important consideration. Some discussion was about compatibility between devices and also day-to-day measures. And I really liked what we said, I need to check all my notes, about let the research question or the objective determine the device we're going to use. I think something that came up in one of the questions I saw in the Q&A was considering things like, if we're going to do large population-based studies, looking at the cost. And I think that this probably has more implications for researchers from low middle income countries where costs might be prohibitive, but we also might struggle to get some of our participants to simply wear the devices. There's a range of validation studies. We discussed which ones do we use and also include a range of people. And just from my own research where I work with shift workers, one of the things I've struggled with is what is a day? Because for them, a day is not midnight to midnight, you know, it could be midday to midday. So coming with that validation. Something else Ulf picked up on was feasibility, including placement. And we might be doing work with healthcare workers where they can't wear wrist-based devices and so on. So placement, even from a feasibility point of view there. And then lastly, we were discussing at what stage should we involve developers. Some discussion on the correct use of applications. And I think one of the suggestions I might have for Vincent is that in these papers, we do have the author contact details. So perhaps the first step is, if you're picking this up in a particular paper, is to contact the author. And the author might have inadvertently used the application incorrectly. And that might be one way to get discussion going. But I think it's important that developers do need to keep developing, you know. So yeah, so those are some of the discussion points that I've picked up from the sessions thus far. And I've got quite a few notes, but let me see.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah.
And then, well, we can put this all in a nice Jamboard. Annelinda prepared one, and we'll can put the link in the chat. So you can all go to that Jamboard and maybe add your take-home message. Or just mention them in the Q&A so Annelinda can write them down.
Yeah, so I shared my screen for the Jamboard for those who don't know how it works. You can put in a post-it by using this icon, a sticky note or post-it, wherever you like. And then you can type here your suggestion for how we can work better together or any other comments. And I will try to categorize them a bit. Maybe you could put also in your role and to see from what perspective you're on.
And we need to share the link. Or did we share it already?
I think it's in the chat. Yeah, I think the link was shared.
Yeah, so everyone.
7 people joining already.
Fantastic.
Also, you can.
So what? Yeah, so everyone feel free to add your take-home messages or recommendations or action points that we should to bring this field further.
Can I ask
it's really small. Can you maybe make it a little bit bigger, Annelinda? Yes, fantastic.
I think one of the questions in the chat that Paul asked is, I'd like to hear perspective on that. So it's to what degree should we wait to address a research question until a quote suitable method exists? It's interesting to consider in light of what Ulf showed about self-reported wrist device activity, where there's some convergence despite the limitations of both. Be interested to hear what others thought about that, because I think it's an important question.
Paul, you're very welcome to share this on the Jamboard.
Well, I think it's a good point. The main thing I think is that as long as we acknowledge the known limitations of a method, then that at least allows us to slowly move towards more insights, right? Unless, let's say, yeah, we all know that's if a method is really poor, then of course no one wants to do research with it. But if there is at least some acceptable correlation with the things the so-called gold standard, then I think we should just use it in research, but always acknowledge the limitations and the need for additional research. And
would a kind of a consort statement for accelerometer use be helpful for journal editors to use that when papers based on accelerometers are published? Do you think that would help?
Yeah.
I think it is better to have people who are method experts or consider themselves method experts and evaluators to write these kind of joint reviews, which you already see from time to time, that they make a statement about the suitability of a method rather than that researchers are expected to make a statement about the appropriateness of their own methods. I guess there is also something to say for having an independent group of people endorse a method or not.
I mean, I tend to think that in some ways we're maybe harder on ourselves. I think that I like the idea of some sort of standardized reporting of accelerometer data, but I also think, you know, if you look at the 2008 guidelines, which were self-report questionnaires, not every study used the same questionnaire. There's huge variability in what different studies assess and what the purpose and what the validity of those questionnaires are. But to pull it back to the guidelines development, the goal is to get some sort of coherent message across. So it's not that there's a specific number per se. And I think that hopefully we'll see the same thing with device-based measures. The issue is that there's just more rapid development and more methods and more variability, I think, than the self-report questionnaires. But hopefully, I think if you have an important question and you have data that can answer it about health, you should go ahead and not wait until there's a suitable method, but answer it. And then, as Vincent said, acknowledge the limitations. And then as a field, hopefully the good studies will start to converge in a way that is coherent.
Other ideas or recommendations?
I just want to comment on the using combined methods and the research question matters. I think using combined methods also gives us insight into context, because context and matters as well. You know, is physical activity a choice? Is it utilitarian? Is this leisure time physical activity? There's some really nice work coming out with regards to workplace-based physical activity and health outcomes. So when we're looking at these combination methods and getting developers to do things, I think if there's ways to combine that to help us with context, in my world, that's really, really important.
And maybe it has been mentioned, maybe we shouldn't be too focused on physical activity guidelines, because maybe we should change the title of the Jamboard to physical activity research, maybe. Because guidelines are just kind of a translation of data into something that the general public can make sense of.
I guess another way to phrase it for the 90% of people in the session who consider themselves in that researcher, like what are the biggest challenges in your view, especially in intervention studies, which we've talked about maybe less than others in terms of, you know, using devices, how to select which device to use, like what are the biggest challenges that you face?
Yeah, maybe we can make on the right-hand side, maybe all the physical activity researchers can post their biggest challenges. Maybe also with using the more advanced methods that are developed by the method developers, and apparently we don't use them correctly. Don't be shy. This is your chance to pose your opinion or share your frustrations.
Vent. You can put it in the chat too, right? If it's not the Jamboard is complicated.
Or the Q&A. I think not everyone can use the chat, but the Q&A. It is difficult to read for me. Yeah, how do we handle longitudinal data? Because when you turn 18, 19, suddenly the guideline changes. So panel, feel free to jump in any challenges or suggestions. Yeah, developers must keep developing and also attend ISBN-PA to chat with physical activity researchers. And there are more method developments attending ISBN-PA, I can tell you. Vincent, do you have any thoughts of how maybe what steps need to be taken to allow adequate use of open source algorithms? Because apparently it doesn't always goes well.
Yeah, that's the disadvantage, of course, of open source, that it's owned by the community, and therefore everyone in the community should feel a little bit responsible for helping to improve it. So if you're not happy with an open source tool, or you are unsure what something means, then just be proactive and reach out to the developer, or and it can vary from simple things like helping to improve the documentation, or I think that already can make a big difference. So of course, when you pay for a commercial service, you expect to get a service, but with open source, we just also need to be aware that sometimes it's driven by volunteers, but sometimes, yeah, of course, some people like myself are able to do it in working time, but it's either way, you shouldn't expect that someone else takes care of the problems. And most of the open source projects are also at the front line of trying to experiment with new algorithms, with new techniques. So obviously when you develop something new and you first try to get it to work, and then as a follow-up step, you try to update the documentation, and so that's also requires a lot of interaction with users to understand what is not right. So if you are using open source and you are unsure whether you are using it correctly, then at least in my case, I wouldn't mind receiving a quick email summarizing someone's thoughts.
And maybe journals, because I can imagine journals don't have a list, or there is not an existing list of accelerometer or algorithm developers to draw reviewers from, but maybe journals can just ask the developer of the specific algorithm that's used in this paper to just have a look at the use of the algorithm. That could be maybe easily implemented step.
Yeah. Or another step is that the authors of the paper reach out to a developer and find a way to give them an incentive to spend a few hours to brainstorm about the method. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of all method developers, but I'm sure some method developers have, well, method developers might all have need different incentives. So some might ask for money, some might say, oh, I want to be a co-author, another might say, oh, can I have access to your data? I mean, you could start that conversation and in that way actually collaborate before the peer review process.
There's a comment in here about involvement in open source is lower in physical activity research than in other fields. And I think we're sort of all alluding to the point that there has to be some incentive for the developer to stay involved, because once your paper is published, yes, you want to see it implemented correctly, but it's a lot of time you're asking for that developer to continue to maintain open source software and maybe update R packages as the device data is constantly changing. And I know it's challenging to get funding, at least in the US, for methods development research. It's much easier to get funded for health related research. So I think figuring out ways of collaborating or including a developer on a grant that allows them to have some time to think about these things ahead of time is also important. Because nobody's going to want to put out the method if they have to peer review all the papers that ever used it for free and then update all the software for free and continuously maintain. So.
And another thing, if you're as a physical activity researcher, if you're supervising or having someone in your group who's developing methods, I would encourage them to collaborate with other method developers. At first, that might seem scary because you don't want to share your secrets, but in my experience, you can learn a lot from having some interaction, even if it can be informal, it can be a formal or formal. Together with Tom Stewart, you may know, and a few other, and Paul Hibbing, who's who's listening. We have this webinar series where we meet, well, frequently. Used to do every month, but now it's going to be a little bit irregular, where we try to simply tell each other, what are you developing? And in that way, by this knowledge exchange, we hope to stimulate that method developers are also getting better at understanding, what is out there and how to improve their work. And so as a physical activity researcher, you can help with this by challenging the method developer to mingle in the network of data scientists. And
all right, for sake of time, maybe I would like to invite you to meeting rooms. We have meeting rooms at ISPENPA Xchange. So Vincent, you can maybe pick a meeting room and invite people who are interested, maybe other method developers and others who want to exchange more information. And I would like to ask you maybe to say some last words about this session and if it provided what you hoped for.
Yes, well, first of all, thanks to all the panel members and Annelinde and you, Mai, for participating and for your help in making this an interesting discussion, and also to the audience. I think there were lots of questions from the audience. I think if I look back, maybe if we do this the next time, I think it would be nice to have at least some part of the 1.5 hour with breakout rooms where people can just speak freely. It's always a bit difficult to summarize what's going on in the chat. And there were very interesting questions, but of course it's difficult to insert all of them in the discussion. So I think that's, to me, at least a lesson for the future if we do this again. But generally, I'm very happy and I hope the panel members also felt that they were able to say what they wanted to say. So yeah, thanks all. And then, yeah, I have no idea how to set up a chat room, but I will start searching the website to figure out how to do that. So give me 5 minutes.
Yeah, in Feedloop, go to networking and then meeting rooms. Yeah, and maybe we can also share somewhere, probably the Jamboard. So you can have a quiet look later. Okay, thank you all for joining us. Excellent panel, thank you, and enjoy ISBN Exchange.